Hello, lovely friends from Anselm. It is such a pleasure to be with you at this online conference. I only wish I could have been there at the real thing. I know well the glories of Glenary, but it's a pleasure to be joining you today. I'm greeting you from the south coast of England on a very autumnal day. We have blustery days and cool winds and the grey skies, and I live in a little town near Brighton. I always, when I'm trying to explain where I live, think of Lydia saying, "But I want to go to Brighton." So we're very close to Old Brighton, just a few towns down along the coast. And I live near the downs, which I can see just out my window, just the tops of them barely. And so I feel like I live in Hobbit country in many ways. There's a lots of landscapes around here that I feel like I recognize from reading the work of Tolkien, who's a great love of mine. So greetings from England. It's a pleasure to take part in this. And yes, I want to talk today a little bit about what it means to be someone who enters into the meta-narrative of God's story, who is a creator and a bringer of beauty, but specifically in the context of suffering or pain. I mean, in some sense, I think we always have that in the background of our thoughts, because the need for a great story is because of the brokenness of the world. You know, the great story is that God came to save and rescue and redeem us from the Shadowlands, from the darkness. He is the one who takes the tale that died with our sin and fallenness and renews it so that it becomes the story of our pilgrimage to the new heavens and the new earth that he's making. But I have thought often about what it means to be a creator and an imaginer of goodness, made in the image of God, specifically as it comes to being someone who bears an answer to the grief of the world. To me, the conditions of creation, the conditions in which we imagine, are those in which a world is marked by suffering and grief and loss. And so any good thing we create is something at risk. Anything good that we create is something that also is the signpost of what is often opposite in the world. So when we create homes or music or books or stories or art that encapsulates or images forth God's beauty, we often are offering evidence of an opposite story being told in a radical and subtle way throughout the fallenness of the world. But my story with this, I have to tell you a bit of my story and then tell you a story, because what I want us to move towards as we think about it is being creators and artists who are creating the third gallery. And I'll tell you what I mean by that in just a minute. But my own story, I think, as a person and very much as a writer and one who senses or has a sense of being called forth to bear God's goodness and to witness to his beauty in the world, is very much caught up in my own darkness, the deepest and darkest things of my life. Many of you know I've written a book called This Beautiful Truth, how God's goodness breaks into our darkness. But in many ways, what that is just the story of my encountering or being rather knocked down by mental illness when I was 17 years old. So at 17, I was diagnosed with OCD, a form of it that just meant my mind was filled with images of disaster and loss. And I couldn't see the people I loved without seeing them in awful situations. Everywhere I looked, it was horror. I just don't know how to explain it exactly to this day. But it's, OCD is the presence of intrusive thoughts, and often the thoughts that to this day still intrude upon my mind are the images of those I love dying or being hurt and harmed. If there's a disaster that could happen, I've probably imagined it already. And so I think at 17, this was an incredibly overwhelming experience for someone raised in a Christian home to believe in the goodness and love of God. And all of a sudden, my safe, and in a way, I never thought the world was completely safe, but I had not yet been touched by the darkness in a personal way. And suddenly that was swept away, where the darkness was actually inside of me. And I could not understand how God could be loving and how God could be my Savior, and that this would still happen to me. And so in many ways, the condition both of my faith and my writing has been the wrestling with that question: where is God in the presence of our sorrow? How do we find him again after a time of grief? How do we wrestle with him? And I took these questions with me. For many years, I wrestled with them in secret and darkness and in my journals and in scripture. But I took them with me finally when I was 30 years old. You're never too late to start school. My husband likes to tease me that I started school for the first time because I was homeschooled. When I was 30 years old, I enrolled in Oxford University just for a one-year course. but I came across this word called Theodicy in the first week of my doctrinal studies. And Theodicy means, it's a fancy Greek word that basically means how we justify God. So when we see a world that is broken and evil and awful, how do we justify God's goodness and his power? How do we hold those two in tension with the fact of a fallen world? And I realized when I saw this that this was the question I had been circling in my mind and imagination for years. I had been wanting to understand how the creator of a beautiful world could yet allow such suffering and evil. So in many ways, I began to bring all of the questions of my past years to this study. But one of the first things I realized was that when I thought back to the things that had convinced me of God's goodness throughout my life up until that time, the things that were the most powerful for me, the places where I had encountered his goodness, been drawn forward into a place of healing and redemption, had been my experiences of the beautiful. It really, in many ways, my experiences of imaginative beauty, of creation, of art. So Tolkien's Lord of the Rings was instrumental in helping me to imagine the possibility of God's goodness again. I stopped reading my Bible when I was 17. I couldn't figure out who God was. I had my own very quiet, introverted mini rebellion. But then I started reading Lord of the Rings, and I think God chuckled, because here was this epic story of good and evil, of people caught up in the battle, of loss, of suffering, and yet of people who chose, as Gandalf says, what to do with the time that is given them. And suddenly I was confronted with my capacity to choose and my capacity to believe either the story of despair, which is what all the characters who fail are the ones who believe in despair in the story, but those who are wise, those who are beautiful, who are mighty, they hoped, and they hoped with a might and a will. So Tolkien's story, music, Celtic music, I would listen to this aching ancient music and feel that my own soul was being woven together by this melody that somehow managed to capture the deep sense of my anguish and also the deep sense of my hope. And I remember in those moments, there were certain songs I could hear and I would think, I can imagine heaven in this moment. Art, I write in my book about encountering the Song of the Lark by Jules Breton in the Chicago Art Museum, and this moment of you see a girl looking up at the sunrise and you realize she's listening for the music of a lark, and it arrested me across the gallery because it was this image of hope and of wonder and of a startled faith arising in the midst of a very barren and quiet and dark landscape. So all of these things had in some sense not just told me why I should believe in God again after my season of suffering and after this ongoing battle with OCD, but it startled me into a place where I was able to taste and see and almost to touch the goodness of God in a visceral way that invited me back into the story, into the meta-narrative of his kingdom coming in the world. And so as I brought this realization to my studies of theodicy and began to wrestle specifically with the story of Job, and the way that God answers Job, not with arguments or not with explanations, but with a tour of the grandeurs of creation, that God gives Job this great picture, this moving image of his goodness. He says, in a sense, there's a mystery in the suffering. He doesn't come wanting to explain everything to Job. That is somehow beyond the scope of what we can see in this time. But God comes to Job and says, look at the beauty, look at the morning stars, look at the storehouses of snow and hail, look at every aspect of creation. And then in the mystery and wonder and splendor of that, I'm asking you to walk forward in this goodness that you can taste and touch and see, in this beauty that shows me to you as good. And so I began to realize that many of the theodicies I would read in my theological studies, they were excellent arguments, but they were arguments. And I often felt like they were kind of like lawyers' briefs trying to protect God against accusation. But the thing is, I don't think God really needs protection against our accusation. He's very capable of holding our wrestling and our questions and our anguish within his mighty arms. And so I began to work towards, as you can read in the book, this understanding of theodicy as something that is not an argument God gives us, but beauty is God's theodicy, that we are encountered by his goodness, that he breaks into our darkness, not just with words that tell us what we ought to believe, but with visceral encounters of who he actually is that engage us afresh. That I think in the midst of pain, we are often knocked out of the story. We feel like we're knocked out of the meta-narrative of God's goodness and redemption in the world. And our encounters with the beautiful, with creativity, with imagination, these are invitations back into the story. So I began working and wrestling with this. But one aspect of it that I think was still very kind of in the midst of being formed in me was what part I had to play in being someone who witnessed that beauty for others. So I began to progress in this idea of beauty as God's Theodicy that is offered to us. He offers us not an argument, but the beauty of his world, the beauty of the sacraments, participation in himself. He offers us himself, the incarnate Christ who comes into the world to bear our darkness. He is the image of God's greatest beauty, Christ come among us, and invites us into this new story that he is creating as he remakes the story of the world, renews everything, recapitulates it, as some of the early church writers would say. He doesn't trash the story. He doesn't discard everything he's made. He draws us back into the midst of it. But as I was kind of progressing in this way, I think that something I had to figure out for myself was what part I had to play. Having encountered God's beauty, having been drawn into a sense that he was creating something and drawing me into goodness again, having experienced companionship and friendship, music and story in such a way that I had the capacity to imagine again that I was being healed and drawn forward into renewal and into the good story of God's kingdom in the world. What then was I called to do with that capacity? Well, let me then tell you a story. In the midst of all this wrestling and yearning, I was on a trip with my mother. Years ago, we went on a big she's, as many of you know, a speaker and a writer, and I went with her as her kind of a companion and assistant on a speaking trip throughout Europe. And we arrived in Poland one early spring morning. Poland was where my mother worked as a missionary when she was a young woman. And she was taking me back to see some of her favorite parts of Warsaw and the places she'd lived and the places she'd prayed and seen God's goodness at work. Well, we had been wandering the city. It was a very raw, cold morning, and so kind of our skin felt like it was about to freeze off. So we saw an art museum, and we decided to just step up and go look at the gallery, get out of the cold. And it was so deliciously warm inside. But we stepped into this big, beautiful, echoing room, and for a minute, it felt like stepping into a cathedral. The springtime light, it bounced off the walls. I just remember thinking that they were high and cream-colored, and that it was like looking up into the tall windows of the cathedral. And along this beautiful kind of spring light-lit gallery were these great and beautiful paintings. And they were images of women and men, farmers and soldiers, and kind of their soldiers in times of peace, farming families and peasant women at work in the fields and the gardens, and children in these billowing pinafores amidst flowers, and beautiful ancient homes and grand gardens and beautiful horses. It was this, you walked amongst this gallery and you felt as if you could almost catch the chatter of the portraits talking back and forth to themselves. And there was this happiness, this kind of glowing sense of victory and pride that came from these paintings, and they were very clearly to me the evidence and artistic evidence of a culture that was hearty and hale and happy and rooted in the earth and in its own strength. It was an age of the people that was full of hope and goodness and a rootedness in the goodness of their hands and the goodness of their work. And I remember just feeling the joy of it and just sensing that radiant joy that comes when you see lives lived quietly and rootedly and well. And so I thought, oh, what a beautiful aspect of this history. I love this. So then left that gallery and walked into this little anteroom and went to the next gallery. And it could not have been more opposite, that I can still, to this moment, remember the sense of being smacked in the face with this. It was image after image of violence and desecration. In the first one or two portraits, I can't remember how many in, there was the image of a little boy staring straight ahead. It was mostly blue-toned painting with dead bodies around him as they were shot by soldiers. And it was image after image of that kind of destruction, of death, of violence, of rubbled cities. And it was this long, low, snaking gallery, and the ceilings were very low, and it literally felt like being enclosed in kind of a mad dream. And I was kind of mesmerized, going painting to painting, just with the horror of this gallery, and made it back to the antechamber and just sat down and had to process it. And I remember thinking, oh my goodness, these galleries are the art, both of them contain and bear art created by the same people, by the Polish people. I'm witnessing the history of a people here, because I think often that's what art is. It's the history. It's the story of what we love and what we value and what we're proud of. And so I always am fascinated to look at cultural histories through its art. But I think I was shocked to realize that such beauty and hope and happiness could be next to such pain and destruction and loss. And I remember sitting in that little anteroom thinking, the same people of their history told these two stories, but which story is the truer one? Because you have the beauty and you have the breaking, but what comes after the breaking and after that loss of innocence? And at that moment, I remember having a sense of, oh my goodness, one of those Holy Spirit moments where you feel confronted by and conspired against by the world and by God. And I remember thinking, this is the same question I have to ask myself. I have known God's beauty. I have known his goodness. There's an innocence that all of the years of my childhood, I was immersed in goodness and stories and music and starlight. I remember the starlight of my Colorado mountain nights. I have this whole gallery in my imagination and mind and heart that evidences God's love and his tenderness and goodness. And then I also have this second gallery, this gallery of pain and loss, of every OCD image I've ever had, of the disasters that I'm afraid of, the disappointments, the many things I couldn't do because of OCD. It was a period of such loss as this doors closed to me, I couldn't leave home, I became physically ill. And so there's this gallery in my heart of all the things that I had lost. And I think we each bear that. I think we each bear both galleries, the first gallery of innocence and hope and beauty, and the second gallery of our breaking. But the question I think that God was putting to me, and that he puts to each of us as image bearers, as people told back into the meta-narrative of his story, is what will you make of the third gallery? Can a third gallery be created in our hearts? And what I had to figure out for myself in that moment was what it means to be a person of the third gallery. Because what I think we are called to do is to begin to create out of the darkness. When we are encountered by God, when we encounter his beauty, when we are called forth, we are meant not just to follow him, but we're also empowered to speak of the beauty we've found, to witness to it, and to create it again. The thing is, the third gallery, it's not something we begin ourselves. The third gallery is opened in our hearts and created by the presence of God breaking into our pain. It's Christ coming into the shadows and clearing them away and creating the new space where he will create afresh. But once that third gallery has been created in our heart by the goodness of God, by the living power of his love as he forges a new space within us and calls us forward to be people living his story, his meta-narrative afresh, I believe that we are called to fill and create new images with which to fill that gallery. Images that are our own witness to his goodness, and images that I believe become those offered to the rest of the world as evidence and encounters with his beauty. Every song we create, every story we begin to tell that speaks to the way we have been redeemed and loved and held, the way we have encountered his goodness, the way we have seen his power entering into the dark moments of our lives. These become images in the gallery, the third gallery of our hearts, and the third gallery that in a sense becomes the whole of our lives and our lived stories. So there's a sense in which I think the third gallery is something God creates inside of us, but it also becomes the very stuff and space of our lives. And so I like to think, I just think God is profoundly incarnational. He loves to come into the nitty and the gritty of our lives. He is a God who took on human flesh and resacralized the whole of creation. And it's the stuff of our most ordinary that he comes and in which we are meant to witness to his goodness. And so I think that our lives in that sense become the third gallery in which what we are creating and what we are forming becomes the evidence and offering our witness to his goodness. I like to think of it a little bit. I don't know if you can see behind me. I call this my wall of small wonders, all of these pictures. They're little cards and images I've picked up from around the world in all of my travels. But each one of them is for me an image of hope, of beauty, of courage. Just glimpsing them throughout the day, they help me to keep in mind what I am creating and what I'm becoming. That I am meant to be a gardener, a homemaker, a writer, a storyteller, a lover of my children and my husband and of the lost and the lonely in the world. These images, they're snapshots, they're paintings, they're etchings, they're illustrations that people have offered out of their own glimpses of the beauty of the world, and I take them in my turn as evidence, this little gallery of beauties that amounts to the inspiration for a whole life. And I think that's what I want us to think about becoming as those who walk in the meta-narrative of God and those who are telling his story and living it afresh. Is first, how can we refill the galleries of our own hearts with those kinds of small beauties? How can we accept his goodness in each story, in each piece of music? Let us keep it, hang it on the walls of our hearts as evidence of his goodness. Let us believe the truth that beauty tells. But then let our lives become images of his goodness to other people. Let what we create become the portraits that they can hang in the new gallery of their own hearts. And so in that sense, I love thinking about us as creators, as image bearers, as characters in the grand and mighty story that God is telling in the world, because each of us is called to be a maker of beauty for ourselves in response to God's goodness as an act of gratitude, and also for the saving of others. We who have been saved by the great beauty who is God himself, breaking into our darkness, reaching out to us, clothed in the hands of story and art and song and nature and person, we are then called and empowered to be made agents of beauty in our turn, offering forth art and music and story and song in such a way that we witness to the great story that God is telling. We invite those who are suffering into a renewed sense of their own place in that story. We offer them a world in which they can re-encounter the goodness of God. So I hope that makes some level of sense, but it's a pleasure to take part in this. I am inspired by just beginning to go through the sessions offered at this conference. It's a dark old world out there. It's a broken one. It's a wrestling one. But I think we have such a mighty and beautiful call to be those who create homes and songs, who tell stories, who defy the darkness with the sweet and gentle power of beauty. So, bless you in all of your creating. May you know the story and live it well. And I will see you again sometime. Goodbye.